radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Hello there, everybody. My name is Jerome, and I am the Sane Environmentalist. Today we are talking with Mr. Don Hancock. He is the director of the Southwest Research and Information Center. It is an organization designed to protect us against nuclear waste issues across the nation. So welcome, Mr. Hancock.
Hello, Jerome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, it's an opportunity for us, absolutely. So will you tell us something about what is the Southwest Research and Information Center, please?
We're a 46-year-old nonprofit organization. We think of ourselves as a technical assistance group that assists a variety of communities to deal with mostly environmental justice, natural resources, and environmental health kinds of issues. So we work on a wide variety of issues. One of the issues we've worked on for most of the lifetime of the organization is nuclear waste, because within about a year after the organization was founded, the then Atomic Energy Commission, the federal agency that's forerunner of the current Department of Energy, came to New Mexico and said they were going to put the nation's first geologic repository in New Mexico, and people wondered about that and whether that was a good idea or not. So among the things we've done for a long time is work on nuclear waste issues.
Excellent. And what are your biggest concerns regarding the waste isolation pilot plant?
Well, currently it has reopened for somewhat limited operations and very limited in comparison to what it was doing before 2014. But the idea of geologic repositories is to put waste deep underground, and the WIPP site where waste is disposed is 2,150 feet below the surface. So the idea of geologic repositories is to put waste in the ground in a place that it will safely stay there, be contained there for, in the case of WIPP, the regulatory standard is 10,000 years, but the hazard of plutonium-239, which is the main radionuclide, is the half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000 years, which means 250,000 years and literally thousands of generations could be affected by this. So the concept is you put the waste in the ground in a place that's going to be contained. Well, waste has radioactivity has already been released from WIPP during the operational phase, so which was never supposed to happen. So the idea that it will safely contain waste for 10,000 years, the regulatory period, or generations, the risk period, is clearly not true. I mean, it's already failed that test. It could certainly fail at worse in the future, and so now it's a very difficult facility to operate. Because so much of the underground, more than 8,000 linear feet of the underground tunnels are contaminated with radioactivity. So workers in much of the underground and the workers who are now trying to put waste in the underground have to wear protective equipment and breathing apparatus. Think Ebola workers, that kind of equipment. So that's not a good way to handle anything in an underground mine, let alone radioactive waste in an underground mine. The underground mine, again, because of this contamination, the underground also doesn't have adequate ventilation, which again makes the working conditions harder and makes the stability of the mine much more at issue because it is in salt. Salt moves a few inches a year, and when you don't have enough ventilation and it's contaminated, you can't do the kind of maintenance work of the mine to keep the floors from heaving and the ceilings from collapsing, and so therefore we have ceilings of rooms collapsing very near where workers are also trying to put waste into the underground. So again, these are not safe operating conditions for this facility now, let alone how it will function long term, because it's also in an area of there are more than 500 oil and gas wells within 2.5 miles of this site, right up to the boundary of the 16 square mile site. There is now, in the last few years, there started to be fracking going on in the vicinity. There are known oil and gas reserves at a deeper level than where the waste is being placed at the site. There are known pressurized brine, in other words, saturated salt that's under artesian pressure that can flow to the surface from underneath where the waste is. So there are lots of geologic issues with this site, and there are proven operational problems with the site, as I say, in terms of occupational problems, ceiling collapse problems, and radiation release problems.
So what types of waste are they putting into the WIPP?
WIPP is limited by federal law to what's called defense transuranic waste. That's bomb-making waste, plutonium-contaminated waste from making nuclear weapons. Much of the plutonium manufacturing that created the waste that comes to WIPP was done at the Rocky Flats plant near Denver, Colorado, north of Denver, Colorado, that operated for more than 35 years and produced most of the nation's 50,000 plus nuclear pits. And that process, that manufacturing process, created a lot of contamination, tools and clothes and sludges and equipment and things like that from the manufacturing process created waste. The waste in general was put in 55-gallon trash cans. So think of a 55-gallon drum that's used as a big trash can. So each of these thousands of containers of waste that comes to WIPP is a little bit different, and the records of how good the records are of what was being put in the trash cans, of course, can be spotty at best. Most people don't keep detailed records of what they put in their trash cans. And in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, workers at the nuclear weapons sites, especially Rocky Flats, didn't necessarily keep really good records. So in some cases, and this is a problem, in some cases you don't know exactly what's in the containers. But WIPP is by law prevented from having any commercial waste, so no waste from commercial power plants of any kind can come to WIPP, and no high-level waste from creating nuclear bombs can come to WIPP. So it's a significant amount of waste, but it's a limited amount in comparison to the much greater amounts of radioactivity that exist, for example, in spent fuel from commercial nuclear power plants, or high-level waste from weapons production that is, for example, at the Hanford site in Washington, the Savannah River site in South Carolina, and the Idaho National Lab in Idaho.
Okay, and I've read that there's two different categories of waste. There is contact-handled and non-contact handled waste. Can you explain for us, please, what is the difference between those two?
Yes, so contact handled and remote handled are the technical jargon that are used at WIPP. Contact handled, as the name implies, means that I or you, people could walk up to those 55-gallon trash cans of waste and not get any appreciable dose of radioactivity because, again, most of the waste in those containers is alpha emitting, and so the carbon steel of the containers will shield people on the outside from the radioactivity on the inside. By the same token, there is some amount, it's less than 5% by volume, but a much greater percentage of that by radioactivity of the waste. Again, it's still plutonium-contaminated waste, but it's called remote handling because, as that implies, you could not walk up to the container without getting a significant dose of radioactivity because the metal container itself doesn't contain all of the radioactivity, and therefore it actually has to be handled in lead-shielded containers, and it has to be handled by equipment, not by people physically moving around. So people are shielded in transportation, in packaging, and disposal at WIPP. So remote handled waste includes beta, gamma, neutron radioactivity that is penetrating and does require shielding. Okay.
So other than what we've already talked about, are there any other geological issues regarding the long-term storage of these waste products at the WIPP?
So, the kinds of things I've mentioned are, in essence, enough. The thing, I guess, for people to understand is for the last 60 years or so, or starting about 60 years ago, when people in the United States started looking at, well, what kind of geologic formations would one use to put waste deep underground? Salt was seen as a preferred geology for several reasons. One is there's lots of salt. There's salt all over the country. So there are significant salt deposits. So there's a lot of it. Two, it's easy to mine. People have been mining and not necessarily needing high-tech mining techniques. People have been mining salt for literally generations. So it's easy to mine. As I've mentioned, salt does move, and that's seen as both a problem, as we've talked about, but also a positive thing, because the idea is you create holes in the salt to put waste in, but the salt will naturally move to kind of enclose and encapsulate the waste. And so that, again, that's another seeming positive element. A fourth element is, as anyone knows, if you have salt and fresh water, the fresh water will dissolve the salt. So the fact that you have lots of salt, hundreds of feet thick salt at WIPP and other places in the country, means that there is not flowing fresh water going through it, dissolving the salt. So again, that means that it's relatively pure salt, and there isn't water and flowing fresh water. And again, one of the ways that waste can be released from geologic repositories is if water's coming through in some way and taking waste either laterally through aquifers or other water-bearing stratas, or bringing it to the surface. So again, that's perceived as another favorable characteristic. However, most of the world has now decided that some of the negative characteristics of salt, some of which we've talked about in terms of relationship to natural resources, the closing up features, the creep features, are not so attractive, and in fact there are other rock types that other nations of the world, except for the United States and Germany, feel are more favorable, and that ranges from things like granites to shales or limestones that again are very frequently occurring in the United States and many other countries of the world, and are perceived to not have some of the same negative characteristics of salt. So other nations of the world who are looking for geologic repositories for spent fuel, high-level waste are really not looking at salt. They're looking at these other rock types. So again, what 60 or so years ago was viewed as a pretty positive geologic formation is not viewed as such. The other thing to say about the WIPP site per se is it is pretty pure salt, halite, but it's not totally. In the depositional process, when this was an ocean, as the ocean evaporated, you, rather than having totally pure salt, there are layers, for lack of a better term, usually called interbeds or marker beds at WIPP, where you have non-salt layers. In some cases, they are very narrow, just an inch or two. In some cases, wider than that. Usually, this is anhydrite, which is a more brittle element, and so again, you have horizontal cracks, fractures, by which again either water could flow in, or under some circumstances waste under pressure could come out horizontally. So that's not such a good feature of WIPP. That also, those interbeds also contribute to some of this floor heaving and ceiling collapsing that I talk about, because again, as the salt moves, those anhydrite layers are more likely, rather than to sort of move like hard toothpaste, like kind of salt does, they're more likely to crack. And of course, when they crack, what's above them and below them can collapse, and so you can have literally tons of salt coming down from the ceiling. So again, that's another characteristic of this particular site that is problematic, that it does not always happen at other salt sites. So like pure salt sites, where you have dome salt, for example, rather than bedded salt at WIPP, usually the dome salt is actually much closer to 100% halite.
So I heard actually that they had an issue with a cave-in and maybe an exploding barrel there. Can you tell us about that, please?
So in February of 2014, two events that were never supposed to happen happened. On February 5th, 2014, a fire broke out in the underground. And in any kind of a mine, one of the most feared things to happen is a fire. Workers can get killed in a fire. Explosions are bad things, and collapses of mines or flooding of mines or other just occupational problems that you don't want to have in mines and affect miners. So in this case, it was a salt hauling truck that was hauling salt that caught on fire. The smoke from the fire went all the way up to the surface, which again showed that the ventilation system wasn't working properly even then. But there were more than 80 workers that were underground, all of whom had to be evacuated because of the fire and because of how the ventilation system was working, and in some cases was misdirected. While the workers were able to be safely evacuated with nobody physically being burned, there were workers that had smoke inhalation, and one worker had such severe smoke inhalation that he was permanently disabled. He ended up suing the contractor, Nuclear Waste Partnership, that operates the facility, and had an out-of-court settlement of some amount of money. And again, that's sealed exactly how much money, but that the worker is permanently disabled is, of course, public knowledge, and that he did sue and he was given compensation. That happened. So that was one bad event that shouldn't happen. As a result of the fire, the underground mine was mostly closed down. I mean, in other words, there wasn't... on February 5th, when the fire happened, they were bringing waste into the facility, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that all stopped because of the fire while they investigated the fire to figure out what happened and those sorts of things. So 9 days later, on Valentine's Day of 2014, this was a Friday night, no workers were in the underground, but the only operating radiation monitor, called continuous air monitor, alarmed. So that alarm was picked up on the surface, so maybe something is going on here. They checked, the radiation technicians tried to check, and they said on that night and the next day, no radiation. Something happened because we have an alarm in the underground, but there was no detection of contamination of workers or equipment or anything on the surface. They were so confident, unfortunately, that there wasn't a release that they allowed the normal shift of more than 100 more workers to come in the next day, the next Saturday morning, to work, which should have never happened. All the 13 workers that were there that night ended up being contaminated, and nine of the workers that came on the Saturday morning ended up being contaminated internally, with internal contamination from breathing in americium and plutonium, the two major things that were released. Unfortunately, neither Friday night nor Saturday, nor even Sunday, nor Monday, nor Tuesday were any of the workers informed that they had been contaminated. In fact, they and the public were told there was no release at all on the surface. So it wasn't until Wednesday that the independent monitoring organization called the Carlsbad Environmental Monitoring and Research Center's analysis on the surface, in other words, so these are radiation detectors on the surface, not in the underground, showed that there was radiation from the underground that was out on the surface. So it was at that point that the public and the workers were told that there had been a radiation release outside into the atmosphere, and at that point workers started being tested, and as I say, it was ultimately found out, in some cases not till more than 6 weeks after they were exposed, that these 22 workers had internal contamination. Department of Energy and the contractor said, well, they got 10 milligrams or less of internal contamination, so that's not enough to hurt anybody, so everything is okay. I disagree that they really know that much about how much contamination the workers have, and I always have disagreed with the idea that they never checked the workers' homes or families, because again, the workers could have carried contamination on their clothes and shoes, etc., taken it to their homes, tromped around their home for several days, etc., but again, nobody's home was ever checked for radiation contamination, etc., examinations were given to any of the workers, etc. So if you were a worker and you were contaminated and you were concerned about the contamination, you would have to pay to get a second opinion, go someplace outside of Carlsbad to do so. So I just disagree with how all of that was handled. Subsequently, okay, so why was there radiation release from Panel 7, as it's called, one of the 7 underground areas? After several months of investigation, again, because the contamination, people couldn't go down and look at the area of contamination. People could go with protective equipment and get cameras in to try to see if they could figure out what had happened. They ended up getting pictures of one container that had come from Los Alamos National Lab that clearly exploded and released radioactivity. It's, in my view, possible. So the Department of Energy says there was one drum that exploded and caused this contamination. I think it's clearly possible that there was more than one drum that leaked, given the amount of radioactivity that was released. But at least one container from Los Alamos did blow up and caused this contamination that we've been talking about. That's now been there for will be 4 years next year on Valentine's Day. So those things were never supposed to happen. The fire, the radiation release were never supposed to happen. They did happen, and they've continued to affect the operation of the facility.
So, have there been any adverse health effects reported by the community or workers at the WIPP so far? As I say, from the fire, yes, there was one worker who was permanently disabled from smoke inhalation. So that's clear. DOE says that none of these 22 workers, they didn't do any follow-up investigations, but they say none of those 22 workers suffered any effects. Because there isn't any follow-up, one doesn't know for sure whether there were effects, and as I say, one doesn't know whether there was contamination beyond just the 22 workers. The area on site, where, as I mentioned, the CMERC, the independent monitoring, is still on the area of the site that is closed to public. So in terms of any significant amount of radiation release into the environment that could have affected people nearby, we don't know that any of that happened. And as a practical matter, members of the public that would be closest would actually be people who are working, for example, in those oil and gas wells that we talked about earlier. So we don't know that there are any adverse public health effects. We don't know that there were any adverse health effects of the 22 workers. Because as I've already mentioned, I was always concerned that the workers weren't getting independent monitoring and independent medical treatment by people who are experts in internal radiation contamination, which is its own narrow set of specialties, because fortunately most people, members of the public and workers, don't work around radiation such that they're getting internal radiation contamination. So there aren't as many medical and health professionals to deal with that. They don't exist all over the country, so it's a specialized thing. So I've always been concerned from the very beginning about worker exposure, what's known and what may not be known. So I've constantly asked WIPP site people, what's the status of these people? Most recently, I asked how many of those 22 workers continue to work at WIPP, and they said about half. So again, that raises the question of, where are some
some of these other folks, do they have adverse health effects? And if they do, people at the WIPP site wouldn't necessarily know it because they're no longer working there, et cetera. So, as I say, we don't know. We don't know that people are suffering adverse health effects. But of course, the other thing to say is the health effects from internal contamination from plutonium is small amounts of plutonium in the lung can cause fatal lung cancer. Well, but that doesn't happen in normally a day, a week, a month, or even a year. As people who are smokers know, usually it's an accumulation over time that results in cancers being created. So if there were or will be health effects from people who were contaminated, it may be years before that happens. Again, people are differentially susceptible to radiation exposure, just like people are differentially susceptible to other kinds of toxic or even viral or bacterial kinds of diseases. So it's unfortunately we don't know. We do know that a lot of workers, thousands of workers that worked at Rocky Flats, creating this waste that we've talked about, did suffer health effects. A lot of that was not necessarily from breathing in plutonium, although some of it was, but a lot of beryllium contamination, berylliosis, which is breathing in toxic dust. So a number of the Rocky Flats workers, are susceptible to that. So the fact that the waste is dangerous and can be dangerous to workers is not controversial. WIPP was designed so that workers were never supposed to be contaminated and were never supposed to be injured. But, as I say, some of them have been. But to what level, we don't know for sure.
So the best laid plans of mice and men. So also I am aware that they did only urinalysis testing on the workers for internal contamination, and that only picks up dissoluble plutonium, whereas if they did a fecal test, then that would pick up the less dissoluble plutonium. Is there anything to that?
So, no, that's not actually accurate. There were around 130-odd workers who got both urine and fecal testing. Again, this was not immediately. This was after, as I mentioned, the Wednesday discovery or public announcement that there had been radiation released on the surface, and so therefore the 13 workers, the 11 workers that were on site when the radiation monitor kicked off on February 14th, and the 2 who came to the site quickly thereafter as a result of the alarm, and then, as I mentioned, there were more than 100 workers that came to the site on the Saturday. So there were urine analysis, but there were fecal analysis done on a number of folks, and so that's why we do have there were fecal samples from a number of the workers. That's a good thing to show again, but it's on the basis of that they reached the conclusion that nobody got more than a 10 millirem dose, which may or may not be totally accurate, I guess is the way I would put it. But yes, again, because there was clearly public concern, and first off from the workers themselves, but people like me on the outside from the beginning were saying, yes, you need to do better testing of the workers. And because of that pressure, primarily from the workers and other folks, there were some testing and retesting done of some workers and some re-examination of the results. That's why I mentioned in some cases workers, even after having urinalysis and fecal samples, were told that they weren't contaminated, and then a re-examination by some other medical people of that indicated that at least one worker who was told he wasn't contaminated ended up being contaminated as a result of re-examination of the, of the testing results. So, but the testing results, so the testing did include fecal samples. So that's just to clear that up. That is important for people to know, but it wasn't done as quickly as it should have been. And a couple other points in all of that. There are chelating agents, medicines that if a worker or somebody who inhales or ingests plutonium in this case, if they take the chelating agents right away, and they like to do it within an hour or soon, at least 24 hours after the exposure, the chelating agent helps it to be excreted from the body. Of course, none of that was done because the workers were told, no contamination. But it turned out, subsequent investigation, there was not enough of the chelating agent at the WIPP site that they could have given it. There wasn't enough to give it to all the workers who were there, even if they, had wanted to do that. Again, back to the point of something was never supposed to happen, so the site was not prepared to deal with the kind of emergencies that they needed to deal with in February of 2014.
It seems to me like one of the big problems that I see with the nuclear industry in general is they don't plan for the unplannable, and then the unplannable always seems to occur. And on that note, are there anywhere in the world, has there ever been any successful salt long-term repositories done?
So there are 3 long-term with a lot of waste repositories. They all are in salt. None of them are high-level waste spent fuel sites. 2 in Germany at the Assa and Morsleben salt mines in the former East and West Germany, and then WIPP. So those are the 3 geologic repositories that have operated for a significant period of time, a decade or more, with significant amount of waste in the world. All of them have failed. Assa and Morsleben were both shut down before their lifetimes because of major problems with the sites. The WIPP site was not. So Assa and Morsleben are permanently shut down. WIPP was shut down for more than 3 years, but is now back in operation. But all the repositories have failed. The 2 nations in the world that now are perceived to be the farthest ahead, in other words, they're saying they are going to open a spent fuel repositories in the next few years, are Finland and Sweden. As I mentioned, they're not using salt, and they're doing some things differently. Their idea is, which is in my view a better idea, is in general that the geology needs to be really good, but they need to put the waste in robust containers that the containers are not so likely to fail as opposed to 55-gallon drums at WIPP, which everybody knows are going to fail. So they're taking a different approach, both in terms of rock type and more substantial containers than what have been done at Assa, Morsleben, or at WIPP. So, those are the kinds of things that are going on. Now, in terms of your broader point about the nuclear industry not planning, in some cases it's not planning, and in some cases it's not thinking. Back in World War II, when the Manhattan Project was going on in the United States, and then during the Cold War, the priority was to create bombs, not to worry about how to safely store or dispose of the waste. So it wasn't even thought about. More recently, it's been, we'll figure it out, and, as you say, the bad things aren't going to happen, and no, they're not prepared very well. The Department of Energy has a long and continuing history of workers. I mentioned Rocky Flats, but workers are being exposed currently at Hanford, for example, where workers are having significant vapor exposures from some of the high-level waste tanks at Hanford. And there are contamination incidents of workers at other sites for accident condition kinds of things. So there's a long history of accidents and not adequate taking care of the workers. The nuclear power industry has, in some cases, a better safety history, even though they're dealing with, in many cases, larger amounts of radioactivity in the form of spent fuel. But it doesn't mean that there haven't been problems of workers at some commercial power plants. As far as we know, the thousands of workers who have direct health effects from working on in the nuclear industry, nuclear weapons, are at DOE, and then the part of the commercial industry that there are problems are the uranium miners and millers, where again we have thousands of uranium miners and ore haulers who have gotten sick, and or many of them have prematurely died from their exposure. So I'm not suggesting there aren't exposures and there aren't people hurt in the commercial nuclear power industry. There are. Sometimes the industry likes to say nobody's been killed or injured. That's not true. But as I say, the folks we know about, the thousands of victims of nuclear fuel cycle in terms of the production and waste handling are.
You there? You there, Don? Did we lose him? I hope not. Hello, Don. Are you there? Hold on, folks. I'm going to call him. It shows that I'm connected. Nope. All right, I'm going to call him right back. Sorry about that.
Jerome?
Yes, thank God.
Well, I could hear you, and I was still talking, but somehow suddenly you weren't hearing me, apparently.
Isn't that weird how that's happening again?
Anyway, so let me, are we back so I can just
We are back, sir. We are back.
Let me try to finish up the thought. The point is that the final point I was going to make here is literally millions of people all over the world have been affected by the fallout from nuclear weapons. I mean, obviously, hundreds of thousands of people were killed in Japan as a result of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs and further health effects of some of the survivors there. But people all over the world have been affected by U.S., Russian, Chinese, French, British, and other kinds of above-ground testing that was done around the world. That we still have fallout from those. Unfortunately, more in the thousands of nuclear weapons tests that were happening. So I'm not at all suggesting that the nuclear industry isn't dangerous, but in general, in terms of the large number of victims of the nuclear industry, we have a lot of clearly documented workers in the weapons complex and from weapons, and as a result of fallout from weapons.
Yeah, I have on my YouTube channel, the Sane Environmentalist, I have an interview with the Rocky Flats worker. Her name was Judy Padilla. She worked there for like 30 years, I think, or 20 years. And she was a glove box worker in the foundry where they were pouring plutonium into the discs for triggers. And she lost both of her breasts to breast cancer.
Yeah.
And so that, I know that just being close to this stuff for a long enough period of time, you will get, something bad will happen to you.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned, that unfortunately, Judy's situation is not at all unique at Rocky Flats. There were thousands of workers who died prematurely or were sick, and there's no question about that. That's not at all controversial at all. In fact, as I say, there are records. Thousands of workers at Rocky Flats have received compensation, and some people who thought they were contaminated have not gotten received any compensation. So that's unfortunately a very significant problem.
So what can we as citizens do to help curb some of these sites and help stop the obvious short-sightedness that's going on with our government regarding the WIPP? And there's what's the other one? And I think it's also in New Mexico.
So there's a proposal to, thank you for asking, there's a proposal to bring up to literally all of the nation's commercial spent fuel and leave it to New Mexico and leave it on the surface by the Holtec nuclear company. So what people can do are a number of things. One is the idea that we need more nuclear bombs, which is, in fact, being talked about, unfortunately, in both the Obama and the Trump administration. That's crazy. We still have lots of nuclear bombs. Building more nuclear bombs in this country or any place only is going to cause sick and contaminated workers. So, first point is let's not. We have a huge problem already. Let's not make it bigger. So that's point one. Point two, with what currently exists, whether we're talking about the weapons side or the nuclear power side, we need to do a better job of, we as citizens need to demand that companies and governmental agencies do a better job of protecting workers and the public from exposures. Third, in the case of things like WIPP, I believe, unfortunately, because there aren't safe disposal places, that the waste, whether we're talking commercial spent fuel or waste from DOE sites, should stay at or very near where they currently are located, not be transported around, which poses, again, additional risk to the public and additional handling. There are some cases where the waste and the facilities could be so dangerous that they might need to be moved a little ways. But again, if the sites were too dangerous to be used to generate the waste in the first place, that would be a bad thing in the first place, and we shouldn't be doing those kinds of things. So
like the Sane
those are things that people can do. They need to demand that governments and state regulators do a better job of watchdogging the facilities in terms of, requiring the most stringent health and safety requirements, not the lesser ones that the nuclear power industry or the Department of Energy all want. Long term, we're going to need to have better laws, and so again, people are going to need to have to get involved in that. There are people and workers, as we've talked about, who've been affected, so acting as advocates for them and demanding that the government actually fairly compensate, and there are laws to provide financial compensation and medical benefits to radiation victims. Those laws can be improved and enforced. So there are lots of things that people can do in terms of awareness of what's going on, what the situation is, awareness of what but you're talking about the kinds of things that can be done to address it. So I would encourage people to do all of those things, and the idea that WIPP should be expanded for more kinds of waste, which is being proposed by Department of Energy and other folks, or that waste should be spent fuel should be transported from power plants across the country to New Mexico or Texas or other places. Those are ideas that people should get informed about and say these are not good ideas.
Yeah, they're calling that consolidated interim storage, right?
They do, and again, it makes no sense. Waste is where it is. The people who have the greatest incentive to keep it safe are the people at the nuclear reactors. They're the ones who've made money off of the electricity that's been generated. They're the ones who need to keep it safe because, as Fukushima showed, if you have a very serious accident, or even 3 Mile Island, which compared to, in the United States, which compared to Fukushima was a minor accident, but, again, that closed down that nuclear power plant. So a small accident or a major accident shuts down the power plant, which means the companies go bankrupt because, they can't make their money anymore of generating electricity. So the corporate entities and, frankly, even the workers who have the greatest incentive to keep spent fuel safe are where it is. So it doesn't really make sense to say, okay, we're going to have the contaminated sites that we currently have with spent fuel, and then we're going to take it to one or more consolidated sites that don't have spent fuel, so that rather than consolidating, you're actually spreading it around, both in the transportation and creating new facilities that don't have spent fuel. So none of that makes any sense. It's an idea that is old. In the 1980s, the Department of Energy proposed it and proposed what they then called monitored retrievable storage sites in Tennessee that were rejected. Their sites were later proposed in New Mexico on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, which was rejected, and then on the Skull Valley Ghost Chute Reservation in Utah, which was a very controversial one. Some of the tribal members opposed it, but that facility ended up getting licensed by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So when people say we need a licensed consolidated interim storage facility, the answer is we've had one for more than 10 years in Utah, but it's never been used because, again, there is a lot of opposition. And so people in Utah said, no way, we're going to let you do this. Just like in Nevada, people in Nevada have said, no, you're not going to do Yucca Mountain as a disposal site because it's such a bad site. So consolidated storage on the surface or in bad underground sites like WIPP or Yucca Mountain is not going to work, and it's going to be opposed. And so we should stop wasting time and effort and money on those kinds of things and agree for several decades. Unfortunately, we need to spend our money on making the waste as safe as it can be where it is and developing a many-decade-long adequate technical program to try to come up with safe geologic repositories, which would first start with agreeing what would be the standard. Is the standard zero release, or as in WIPP, 1 death every 10 years from releases of radioactivity from the site? And then agreeing on the standards, and then start looking for what would be the best sites.
So I've been kind of studying about and hearing good things for the most part about fluoride molten salt reactors and the fact that you can actually consume some of these used fuel bundles in these fluoride salt reactors. What do you think of that idea?
I don't think they're good ideas. I think we need to not decide we can consume in fluoride or molten salt reactors or reprocess spent fuel to extract uranium to use in power plants. I think the nuclear industry has served a purpose of providing some electricity over the last electricity for over the last 50 years, but it needs to be phased out. We need to handle the materials from nuclear weapons and commercial nuclear power plants as waste and do the best job we can of isolating workers and people from them, doing what I just talked about in terms of a long-term program of geologic disposal, and stop spending a lot of money on trying to make the nuclear enterprise safe when I think it's pretty clear at this point that it can't be safe. We had horse and buggy days. We used to create a lot of our electricity from other things, but we now know we can create electricity cheaper and safer from renewable sources like the sun and the wind that we have lots of, fortunately, and some other processes, in some cases geothermal energy, etc., and phase out the nuclear industry like other forms of electricity have been phased out, and like we phased out horse and buggies for transportation. We now know there are better ways of generating electricity, so we should be putting our time, effort, and money into those and phasing out the nuclear enterprise and doing what we can to improve the safety of that storage until we come up with these long-term geologic repository solutions that we've talked about.
So it sounds to me like too cheap to meter turned out to be a bit of a short-sighted statement on the part of the nuclear industry.
Well, it was wrong. It's clearly been demonstrated to be wrong. Nuclear power is very expensive at this point. The reason nuclear power plants are shutting down and new ones aren't being built, there are only 2 that remain under construction in the United States, is that they are, because of the dangers that they pose, whether the workers are being contaminated and the public is being contaminated or not, the risk of catastrophic accidents, again, Fukushima, Chernobyl being cheap examples of it, the risks are so great that they are too hazardous, and because of the high hazard, they're also very expensive to maintain and operate. So again, we have better, more reliable sources. Nuclear power is too expensive. Nuclear weapons, even if you agree that we should have some, we have way more than what we and any other nation needs so we don't need more nuclear weapons, and we can phase out nuclear power over time and replace the electricity with efficiency on the one hand, more efficient appliances and electricity generation and use and store and renewable wind and solar electricity generation and better battery kind of storage, so that we can get rid of nuclear and, frankly, fossil fuels as well.
Excellent. I agree 100%. Sir, I want to thank you very much for taking the time with us today. Again, this has been Mr. Don Hancock, and he works at the Southwest Research and Information Center. I will link to his website in the description. It's sric.org, correct?
Yes.
Okay, then. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah, and I hope that you have a fantastic day, sir. Thank you again for taking the time to help us.
Care.
Thank you.
All right, you have a great day.